All right. So it says I'm live, but we're going to let it buffer there for just a second. Just to make sure that it's doing exactly what it should be doing. Seems to be there. So that's a good sign. So anyway, as always, I am Reverend JR. Today we're going to be taking a look at this thing I found on a blog from Son of Hovind, which purports to have 15 questions for evolutionists. Evolution, the naturalistic origin of life and its diversity. Well, it's not the origin of life, for one. That's abiogenesis that tells us how life began. Denise Hedberg says, I'm here. Hello, Denise. So glad you could join me as we talk about this thing. I wonder if it looks better if I do that. Maybe. Let's make it a little bigger. Perhaps easier to read. Yeah, that's fine. That is fine. There. All right. Let's move it to, oops. That can stay there. I want this one. There we are. That's easier to read, I think. All right. So the first question we have from creation.com, how did life originate? Evolutionist professor, evolutionism is not a thing. You cannot be evolutionist. Evolution is just what describes how organisms change over time. Paul Davies admitted nobody knows how a mixture of lifeless chemicals spontaneously organize themselves into the first living cell. That's basically correct, I suppose. I mean, we have a pretty good idea, but I guess nobody knows for sure, you know? Andrew Knoll, professor of biology, Harvard, said, we don't really know how life originated on this planet. Again, we're not talking about the origin. This is evolution, you see, not abiogenesis. How life began is a separate question altogether from how life changes over time. I was recently watching Aaron Ra, actually, and he was talking about, on his Pratt list he just started, you know, this is one of the things they do. It's all or nothing. Actually, it might have been one of the talks he was giving at some other point. But that's not the point. Let's move this thing over here so it doesn't make so much noise. A minimal cell needs several hundred proteins. Right. Even if every atom in the universe were an experiment, I mean, I guess, with all the correct amino acids present, amino acids don't exist inside atoms. They're made up of atoms. I mean, for every possible molecular vibration, sure, I guess. In the supposed evolutionary age of the universe, that's not how you look at it. It's not evolutionary age of the universe. The universe exists. Cosmology and cosmological evolution are completely different from the kind of evolution that we talk about when we're talking about creatures, organisms, biology, that sort of thing evolving. Not even one average-sized functional protein would form. Citation needed. I need Kent. I need Eric. I need Son of Hovind here to show me why, how does he know this? What experiment has he run that shows them in every other simulation, let's say, that runs for 13 billion years, that no life ever arises on anything? I'm curious to see his citation for that one. Because that's just a baseless claim right now. Creation.com/origin. I don't know. Let's see here. Of course, there is. Well, I don't want to see all that crap. Anyway. So how did life with hundreds of proteins originate? Just by chemistry without intelligent design. I mean, why not? Are you saying chemistry doesn't happen, Eric? Or whoever runs this, I guess? Creation.com. CMI has offices in all those places. Maybe I should create a false religion and get all the tax money from it. In order to do that, I'd have to have no ethics, you see. But yeah, I don't know. How did life with hundreds of proteins originate? Again, that's not a question of evolution. That's a question of origin, of abiogenesis, of something different. Because evolution tells us what came after, not how it got there. That's like saying, well, you know, a car couldn't exist unless somebody made it, therefore somebody must make the chemical reaction that happens in the engine to make it drive forward. It's just silly. The fire just burns once you start it, right? And sometimes fires start completely on their own, like in the forest. That's how pine trees propagate. The pine cone drops, and then a fire happens. The sap that's holding the seeds in the cone lets loose, and then you get a new forest after a while because the seeds are not destroyed in the fire and they sprout when the sun hits them, and you get another forest. It doesn't matter how that process started. The only important part is that it happens again and again and again. 2. How did the DNA code originate? The code is a sophisticated language system with letters and words. No. And Denise Edberg says spontaneous combustion. That's also one thing to look at. Although I think they actually figured out that generally has to do with because people used to smoke and they used to do that sort of thing, that the cigarettes or something outside of them would generally set them off. But yeah, there are things that spontaneously combust, like gasoline, when it reaches its vapor point and the flash pressure, or the flash heat, for example. That's a different kind of spontaneous combustion. I'm not sure which one you're talking about. But yeah, they do happen. So anyway, we were saying the code is a sophisticated language. No, it's not a language. We use the language of the amino acid groups to describe how they interact with one another. Not so much to describe, for example, like what their language literally is, you see. I mean, the way the chemical reactions happen has to do with electrochemistry and biochemistry and that kind of thing. At the molecular level. Just poof. Just heat can ignite like grass in the sun. That's also true. That's a problem with hay storage, actually. If the hay gets too wet, it'll catch fire for some reason. And we still don't understand why the hay gets so hot when it's stacked in a bale and water is added. With letters and words, no, it's nothing like that at all, though. I mean, the DNA is not like a big book. It isn't. Where the meaning of the words is unrelated to the chemical properties of the letters. Right, it's a language we use to describe what's going on in the DNA. It's not actually a language that exists in the DNA. Mike says, hello, I miss these. Well, I'm glad to see you back, Mike. We're going to have a lot of fun with this one. I decided it's time to start getting back and putting my face right here where, like there, where you can see it. Also, I got a beard now, so I guess that's cool. I wish I had better lighting here, but that cost money and YouTube's not paying me, so, drink them if you got them. I do enjoy this kind of thing, though. I'm not sure what kind of videos people like best, so I'm just going to keep throwing them all out there because I enjoy doing all of them. Just as the information on this page is not a product of the chemical properties of the ink, or pixels on a screen. Correct. The information on this page, well, I mean, it is kind of. Because without the information being displayed and arrayed in a certain way on the screen for you to view, you wouldn't get any of the information from it. The pixels on the screen don't actually care in much the same way that the DNA doesn't actually care what order they end up being turned on and off in. They only care that they have signals to turn on and off, you see. That's actually a relatively good analogy, and I'm surprised he skipped right over it. Same thing with the ink from the printer or whatever. What other coding system has existed without intelligent design? Oh, that's not too hard, actually. I mean, if you're considering this to be a coding system, then the lunar calendar and the solar calendar exist as a sort of code based on the fact that the Earth and the other planets go around in a period that can be measured by its distance over time, or how long it takes to go one fraction of a way around it, or something like that. That's equally the same kind of natural code that tells the Earth where to go next in relation to the Sun. Even though you don't normally think about it like that, it's very useful here in understanding how chemical reactions work, like with DNA or with baking soda and vinegar. The baking soda and vinegar, before they react, don't care where they're going to react into, but they're still going to do it based on the way the chemicals work. Or the flashpoint, the spontaneous combustion. It will happen regardless, and the things that will burn regardless of whether someone burns them, you see. So it's actually not a bad analogy. Also, this is a pamphlet, so 1 through 10 or whatever is on this page instead. 3. How could mutations, accidental copying mistakes, sometimes that's what they are. Oh, crap. DNA letters, exchanged letters. No, you don't look at them that way again. Because to presume that everything that changes is a mistake is also to presume that everything that stays the same is a mistake. Because the job of DNA is not to be copied perfectly. The job of DNA is just to be copied. And it can be copied with mistakes and still work pretty well almost all the time. A lot of times the mistakes happen in areas that are unrelated to anything that makes you you. So if the mistake happens in your skin color, for example, then in general, that's not going to affect the fact that you're still human. It's not really a mistake, it's just a different copy. But yeah, you can't think of it like that, because there's no way you're going to get a perfect copy. Even when you clone something, you're still going to have natural variation sometimes. You also have create the huge volumes of information in the DNA of living things. Well, it's not just that. Sometimes you have radiation damage or carcinogenic damage, or the telomeres disappear or stay long more than they should, or other things that aren't related to copying that can cause the mistakes to happen. It could just be that a new variant forms for no reason other than it formed. But I'm getting off topic here a little bit. How could such errors create 3 billion letters of DNA? It doesn't. There's only like 7 letters, I think. The A, T, G, P, and then you can count certain other combinations of letters like the start and the stop and one of the others, I forget off the top of my head. You can count those as separate letters as well, even though they're comprised of the smaller pieces of information. Mike says, "Dear God, so much dumb." That is correct. There's a lot of it on just 2 pages. 15 points altogether. As we said, 15 questions for evolutionists. To change or let's start from the beginning again. How could such errors create 3 billion letters of DNA? Again, it didn't. To change a microbe into a microbiologist. Ha ha ha, that's terrible. There is information for how to make proteins. No, there isn't. There's just chemical reactions that create proteins. And also for controlling their use. Johnny Drive-By says, hey, everybody. Hey, Johnny Drive-By. Much like a cookbook contains the ingredients as well as the instructions for how and when to use them. No, it's not like that, really. That's a good analogy for it, in a way. A better analogy is, for example, a book that explains to you how to use a printing press. And then you need to make copies of that book so other people know how to build and operate printing presses. And then occasionally you make a change that is beneficial or not beneficial, trying new things, and a different kind of printing press arrives until you go from the one Gutenberg had all the way up to the one that's like right here in front of you that can make things like this. I'm planning to go over one of these soon. This is a tract of sorts from the Bible Answers Library. I found it at a Mennonite restaurant one time. I picked it up because I knew I just had to have it. Jesus, he's waiting. You see. So we're going to go over this one at some point because it's much more modern. It's newer than the one that I'm doing on human sexuality or whatever it was. I don't remember the name of it. But this one's called Why Marry? And there's stickers on it that these people have decided to put on it, I guess. There's some really fun things inside of this one, too. But it's not directly related, and it gets the point across that I was talking about with the DNA. So, much like a cookbook contains the ingredients as well as the instructions for how and when to use them, terribly constructed sentence fragment. One without the other is useless. Wrong. You can cook food without a cookbook. You don't ever have to have ever seen a cookbook to learn just on your own how to cook corn from the field. Stick it on the fire. Put it in your mouth. Nutrients go in. Crap comes out. You can't explain that. Much like the tide. Creation.com/meta information. I'll bet you want me to. Mutations are known for their destructive effects. Well, generally because those are the most useful. But my red hair, my red beard here, you can't really see it too well. That's a genetic mutation. The white skin on my face, well, it's kind of pink, I guess. That's a mutation. Normally, most people would be black. The eyes are actually further set out, for example. And I'm looking up because my camera is right there on my top screen. But yeah, my eyes are not set back so far as other primates and other people who are more Neanderthal DNA, who have them further set back, so the cranium is further forward. So I have an advantage that my brain case isn't so far exposed forward over my eyes. And I'll be less likely to hit my head on things, because my nose will get in the way first, you see. Like, the hair on top of my head's a different color. Another mutation. I'm expressing different genes here than I am here, you see. And everything is like that in your body, all the way down to the stuff that digests the food you put into it, to the stuff that makes your leg hair grow, to the stuff that changes the color of your eyes and their whites, and so on. That's all mutations, including all the mutations that you don't even see, that don't get expressed because they just don't happen in humans. They happen in other species that we used to be, which arguably is still humans because we came from them. But it's not. They're completely different. Like other monkeys. They have tails. We have a tiny little tailbone. That's a mutation. It's definitely not a destructive one. Although it does make it harder for us to climb trees, but humans haven't climbed trees in a long time. At least not for the purposes of living in and gathering the majority of our food from. We also don't need them for balance like monkeys do, or other monkeys, apes, because we have that ability in our big toe. If you lose the front of your foot, you lose your balance like a monkey that has lost its tail. That's something we developed because we lost our tails, for example. So let's see here. Mutations are known for their destructive effects, again, because the destructive ones are the most noticeable generally. But heterochromia, for example, when the eyes are two different colors, is very noticeable, not destructive at all, and most people are familiar with it. And heterochromia is when this eye is different from this eye, the color. Including over 1,000 human diseases such as hemophilia. Correct, a lot of diseases are based on the fact that we have mutations. The fact that we overcome some of them is due also to the fact that we have mutations. This is why white people don't generally get sickle cell anemia, because we developed a mutation that causes us not to get it for some reason. Rarely are they even helpful. That's incorrect. A lot of them are just as helpful as they are harmful. Some of them are both. Some of them are neither. They're just malignant or, benign, rather. But, again, why do you start your sentence with a but? Conjunctions are not for the thing that comes after nothing. How can scrambling existing DNA information? It doesn't scramble it. If it does that, you die. Create a new biochemical pathway or nanomachines. No, now you're thinking of something entirely different that isn't actually related to DNA at all. Like the motor proteins and stuff, which are really weird and cool. With many components to make goo to you evolution possible. Again, it probably didn't work that way either. Denise says nature can dictate changes in DNA, so it is not a permanent thing. DNA can change for useful adaptations, the babies will have altered, beaks will change sizes, still be a beak, it won't grow lips, etc., etc. Yes, this is very true. And a lot of times, in sexual species especially, that's us, sexual pressures will cause different traits to be more or less expressed. Remember, when a baby is being copied, you get the DNA copied from both and combined. So you're never going to get a perfect copy of a sexual species offspring because it's going to have traits of the mother and father, or in some cases two fathers or two mothers if you have a really weird thing, or you have the parthenogenesis that happens in species like aphids sometimes, or you get the role reversal that happens in seahorses, for example, or you get stuff like horses and donkeys that can make mules and hinnies. How did a 32-component rotary motor like ATP synthase, oh, he learned a big word, which produces the energy currency ATP for all life, or robots like Kinnison, a postman delivering parcels inside cells, originate? They originated because they were the best designed for that thing, and they happen to stick around in things that manage to reproduce, sexual or otherwise. Some things aren't sexual, like bacteria, and they just, split. Then they make a new one, and they split again. Why? Number 4. Why? Why is natural selection, a principle recognized by creationists, taught as evolution? As if it... Damn, is it just me? No, I think you can see it too. Look at this typography, all right? Look at these letters. Can you see that or not? Look how the T is offset above the A. I thought that was just my eyes, but it's not. The E's are bigger than the L's and the S's and the C's. That's so weird. Who decided on this font? I am not a graphic designer, but if I was, I would be hurting myself right now. Oh, that's why this is so hard to read, mind you. It's not even the bad information, it's just this stupid font. Why would you pick this in something you seriously want people to read? I don't understand. Why is natural selection a principle recognized by creationists, taught as evolution? Because it is. It's the same thing. Natural selection dictates the flow of evolution. If you survive long enough to procreate, then you've naturally selected. If you don't, then you're naturally selected out. Those are the two options. You either produce offspring or you don't. I have no intention to produce offspring, so I am self-selecting out. You could call that artificial. Some people would call that a natural trait, because sometimes populations choose to reduce the number of offspring. As if it explains the origin of the diversity of life, because it does. Somebody with red hair and somebody with brown hair in my past had a child that eventually led to me. And now I've got the red hair and the brown hair and the, like, blue, slate, green eyes or whatever. By definition, it is a selective process. So it is not a creative process. I don't know what that means. Selecting from already existing information. Sometimes new information is created when the two sexual things come together. The sperm and the ova. They meet up and they try to combine their information as best they can, and occasionally new information comes out of it. It might explain the survival of the fittest. The fittest can't survive if they're not born. The fittest can't survive if they can't change over time. You can't get things that are more fit than other things if the things aren't changing, is the general idea here. It might explain the survival of the fittest, blah, 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 but not the arrival of the fittest, blah, blah, blah. Yes, it does. Because if you happen to be more fit, you survive, have more offspring, and then the next generation produces even more offspring based on yours, and eventually the other stuff that isn't as useful stops reproducing, then that explains very quickly, clearly, and easily how the arrival happens. The arrival happens because of the survival, and the survival happens because the thing arrived. It's kind of circular, but it is how it works. And you have to understand it's in stages. It's not just one big thing that's constantly going. The death of individuals not adapted to an environment, and the survival of those that are suited. Okay, you heard that. The death of things that aren't good, and the survival of things that are, in this case, does not explain the origin of the traits that make an organism adapted to an environment. Well, it does, actually. The survival of those that are suited does explain that. Because the things that aren't die off. And then more suitable things are created. Born. Progeny happens. I guess. I don't know how else to explain this. E.g., therefore, the only example. How do minor back and forth variations in finch beaks explain the origin of beaks or finches? Okay, Eric, I know you're not watching this. I wish you were. I wish Ken Ham would watch this and answer it honestly instead of blocking me on Twitter, as Ken Ham has done. Eric hasn't. At least he is trying to be reasonable, I think. Maybe not responding is his way of saying he understands that he's wrong. Until the next time he tries to spread this propaganda. But what we imagine, I guess, the simplest way to explain it, if we want to go for the beaks came about after birds. Finches came about after beaks. Or at least anything you'd think of a bird as and a beak and that kind of thing. So you can imagine that finches have bigger beaks than they used to. Or maybe they have smaller ones than some of their ancestors used to. And they had a big beak and a small beak ancestor. And as they went through time, those two ancestors were about the same at the same time. They may have all just had medium-sized beaks. And then one of them developed bigger beaks and bigger plumage and everything and eventually became crows. One of them developed much smaller beaks and everything and became hummingbirds, and they thinned out and became perfect for that, or woodpeckers. And then you had the finches, which just kind of kept doing the thing down the center. And that explains it. Finches, again, same thing. They split off at some point. Their ancestors could mate with the ancestors of the other things because they were the same thing at that point. Kind of like horses and donkeys are doing right now, or the ring species you can find in salamanders out in California, for example, or many other examples of which I'm not going to list because we're going on to 5. How does natural selection explain goo to you evolution? Sorry, that's the end of 4. I think we just explained it. It didn't start as goo, I guess, maybe, but it also led to everything else, including, you know, some goos that still exist. Lane Hamilton says, "Milady." Lane, good to see you woke up or something. Came back onto the social media. The internets. 5. How did new biochemical pathways, which involve multiple enzymes working together in sequence, originate? I don't know what that means exactly, so let's read it, because it's a lot of poorly defined words being used improperly. I mean, that's kind of like saying, well, fire and food never go together, so how did humans figure out how to use them? Yep. But, you know, every pathway and nanomachine requires multiple protein enzyme components to work. Right. There was a time when they didn't exist because their simpler parts didn't work together, and then eventually did. Or there was one original protein that eventually split into 2 because it was more useful and produced itself more often that way. We're talking about very long spans of time. Everyone thinks of the Cambrian explosion as happening quickly, even. But no, it was the fast thing, and it still happened very slowly. How did lucky accidents create even one of the components, let alone 10 or 20 or 30 at the same time? Well, it didn't create them at the same time. It was probably sequential. You think they're parallel, but they're not. They're in series. Just like the port at the end of my mouse, you see. Vape niche, right? Vape niche. Every pathway and nanomachine requires multiple enzymes to work. How did they create all of them at the same time? But again, they didn't. They occur at the same time now because they built upon one another. In much the same way as a chicken egg comes out as one thing, instead of the individual components it was in the past. Evolutionary biochemist Franklin Harold wrote, "We must concede that there are presently no detailed Darwinian accounts of the evolution of any biochemical or cellular system, only a variety of wishful speculation." I don't know who that is. Lane says, "Rev, I didn't know you were gay." Nope, I'm asexual. Ha ha ha, I fooled y'all together. But no, serious note, yeah, I'm asexual, I just don't care. I know a lot of gay people, I guess. That's fine. But, I'm not. Oh, you're talking about the vape. Ha 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 ha. Funny. No, I got spearmint up in this thing. It is absolutely delicious. Evolution allowed me to do that. Holy crap, yeah. That's a lot of smoke. Anyway, people seem to enjoy watching that, so whatever. YouTube's not paying me anyway. I can kind of get away with whatever I want. Living things, number 6, look like they were designed. Yeah, some of them do. Slime molds don't. Bacteria really don't. Viruses look like they just fell together. I mean, if you've never seen a flu virus, it looks like a screw with a, you know, like a hex on top, and then it's got these weird-looking wiry legs and stuff. They don't look designed at all. They move around kind of by floating in something. They're weird. They're not even alive, but they act like they are. So how do evolutionists know that they were not designed? Because we can demonstrate how baby making works. We can demonstrate meiosis and mitosis and all the good stuff. We can demonstrate all the processes that led to it that do not require any design at all. And we can extrapolate further back, and we can even show that you can create the molecules that are the foundation for the more complex ones without any sort of design, or anything that exists in the natural world can do it all, is a better way to say it. So a little bit of lightning creates ozone. It creates an electrical current that causes the chemicals to mix together in a way they wouldn't, not in the presence of electricity, in the presence of lightning, in the presence of whatever. And it can work. And a god is not necessary to understand that, you know, water evaporates, turns into clouds, falls back down, where it pulls up and evaporates again. And with the exact same level of certainty, we can talk about evolution and all the various stages it goes through. Richard Dawkins wrote, "Biology is the study of complicated things that have the appearance of having been designed with a purpose." Right. They do appear that way on the surface. They are very complicated. They look like they work together well. And it happens to be they look that way because they do actually work together fairly well. Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of the double helix structure of DNA, wrote, "Biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they... Oh, fucking hell. This text is horrible to read. Why did they pick this particular font? It's not monospace or anything. It's not good, easy. I mean, it looks like this PDF was designed, just not very well. But yeah, you get the idea. Yet, if someone attributes the design in living things to a designer, that is not acceptable. No, it's acceptable if you can demonstrate it, Eric. If you can show us evidence of your creator. We can show you, Eric, all the evidence for the parts simply existing without a creator, being formed in the hearts of stars. The stars die, the guts are spewed out, the planets are created, and everything goes from there. As the planets squish together, they get solid core that moves. It gives us tectonic plates, which allow for the hydrological cycle to occur when enough mass comes together to create an atmosphere that allows for the creation of the chemicals that happen to compose us. We can show that the things that exist in us exist in roughly the same proportion on the planet, and that your god or whoever didn't need to bring in anything special to make us. He could have. That would have been a nice dead giveaway, but he didn't. And so on. So everything we see shows us that we come from these things based on all the evidence we can find. And you keep wanting to throw a designer in there that you can't show evidence for. That's why it's not acceptable, because there's no evidence for it. Why should science be restricted to naturalistic causes rather than logical causes? Oh, sorry, didn't mean to grab that. Well, science isn't. I mean, the logical causes happen to be naturalistic. There is no logical cause that doesn't have a cause. If there's a creator, that's fine. Show us the creator. Show us the evidence of the creator that doesn't get explained by something else better. People have tried. Even Tesla, I think, was a steady state believer in that the universe has just always been there and never wasn't. And we demonstrated that it wasn't quite right. The ether and everything, which he thought that everything moved through, doesn't seem to exist. We can explain it better with something else. If the ether did exist, then Tesla would have a much better argument for things being created from it. But it doesn't seem to be there. It's possible he was talking about the nothing that seems to exist where virtual particles come from and everything. But we also have a pretty good explanation of how that works in general, mathematically. We can demonstrate it, even though it's not physically apparent in our time reference and everything, but that's beyond the scope of this. Because we're only talking about evolution, not the origins of much of anything. 7. How did multicellular life originate? From the simpler eukaryotic and simpler prokaryotic life that was single-celled. We have some single-celled life still around, which we would expect because it's not all going to die off. We have multicellular life that doesn't have clearly defined cellular walls and things, making it a giant single-celled organism that you would otherwise classify as multicellular if it had cell walls, for example, but it doesn't. How did cells adapted? How did cells adapted? Now, I realize some of you may not be the native English speakers here, that there is that distinct possibility. But I hope you can see it's not just the font that hurts my head here. How did cells adapted? Denise says, why did only some apes turn into people? Why are there still apes then? She says, I believe in creation and creation evolves. That's fine. The reason they didn't all turn into humans, or humans didn't die off, or whatever, is the same reason you have cousins. Because just because you exist doesn't mean your cousin can't. Just because horses exist doesn't mean that zebras can't exist. They both have a common ancestor. And that common ancestor happened to become distinct at some point. Again, horses and donkeys are doing the same thing right now. And they're creating semi-viable offspring sometimes. But in general, horses go to horses, donkeys go to donkeys. Zebras can breed with all three of them because they haven't separated far enough yet. But zebras don't breed nearly as often or as successfully with horses or donkeys. So that's why the same reason there are different breeds of dogs is the same reason there are humans and apes. Because the apes simply haven't died off yet, though we're doing our best to kill them off, it seems. It's the same reason cows exist, but zebu, and buffalo, and bison, and water buffalo, and other large bovine-type creatures exist. Because there's no reason they wouldn't, because they're not competing with one another, and they're not being preyed on. We've also artificially changed it by farming them, which isn't that artificial either, because ants actually farm aphids. So just food for thought, humans are not the only creatures to farm other creatures. But that's a tangent. There are still apes for the same reason there are still wolves, even though we have domesticated dogs. Or there are still lions, even though we have domesticated cats. Or, you know, bobcats or whatever. But how did multicellular life originate? Again, it came from simpler singular cell life. 8. How did sex originate? That's a bit more complicated, but it's the same idea. Some things became sexual. They had sexual dichotomy of some level. And the two things came together and it was more advantageous to have gestation than it was just to have the things split like bacteria. If you'll notice, a little bit of alcohol can kill off a lot of bacteria, but I do okay with it, and so do the things in my gut. Generally speaking. 9. Why are the expected countless millions of transitional fossils missing? Why is the S higher than the N and the I? And the T is in between. No wonder I've got a headache. Darwin noted the problem, and it still remains. The evolutionary family trees in textbooks are based on imagination, not fossil evidence. Incorrect. They are based on what we happen to find and observe. And I don't know how else to explain that to you. Like, I find this thing sitting here, and it works. And I have evidence that it works. I know that the cloud of smoke comes out of here because it's got a battery in it. The electrons chooch through the coil. The coil gets hot, heats up this liquid enough that it causes it to vaporize or atomize as I pull it across the coil with my breath. And the evidence of that, if you hadn't seen me do it, would be the cloud it creates. So if you just walked in and you only saw the cloud, you could reasonably presume it didn't just magically appear. There is some reason for it. Whether it is that my house is on fire, or I'm burning food on the stove, or I'm vaping or smoking a cigarette, whatever. You can find the reason for it somewhere. But the point remains, why are the fossils missing? Well, because most things don't fossilize. And the things that do fossilize are buried. We can't just go out and look and see most of them. Sometimes we get lucky. Like in a desert, for example. But for the most part, we have to dig for them, work for them. We can see the patterns based on what layers they're in, of where they were and where the tectonic plates were in the past, based on the way they split or come towards one another, and that sort of thing. Lets us know that Africa and South America used to, fit right together, and things used to just walk right across them for millions of years. And they slid apart, and we're still going apart at 3 inches a year or something. About the same speed as Niagara moves away from the center of where Niagara is. Eventually, Niagara is going to resemble the Grand Canyon, just further north. But the point remains, we can see these changes over time and extrapolate them backwards, based on the available evidence we have. We don't have to see every canyon that ever existed to understand how the plate tectonics do that, or how erosion works over the surface of them. Because we have them. They're there. We expected there were a bunch more of them, but we can also show you the ones that exist and how they formed, is the thing. 10. How do living fossils remain unchanged over supposed hundreds of millions of years if evolution has changed worms into humans in the same time frame? Again, that's because different things evolve at different speeds. Coelacanth is the most popular living fossil, and it's largely unchanged because it's very good at doing whatever it does over a very large range of temperatures and acidification ranges and carbonification of the water ranges and that sort of thing. It manages to keep living and doesn't need to change to do it any better. Things have evolved from it that do other specific things better, but in general, they continue breeding and having copies of themselves. They don't go that close to the surface, so they're not affected as much by the radiation from the sun. that sort of thing. And so you have these species that are kind of in their own little niche. It's the same reason New York has a very different accent from California, and they both have a different accent and language entirely from Italy or China. Even though China is arguably one of the oldest languages, or perhaps some of the Zulu languages, or so on, you still have the very old languages, at least as old as have survived, even though we have very new languages like Esperanto, for example. The fact that Japanese happened doesn't stop there from still being Chinese, you see. The fact that modern English exists doesn't change the fact that Old English still has a following. That's why we can still read Beowulf, even though newer versions of English have come about. That's how we figured out who cuneiform works, for example, because it doesn't need to change to keep doing what it did. 11. How did blind chemistry create mind, intelligence, meaning, altruism, and morality? Because we are social species. There is an inherent reason in a social species to not be bad. If you kill people, you're going to get killed. If you do bad things to people, people are going to select against having children with you. So, to a point, and there's a trade-off here in the game theory, because after a certain point, everyone is so nice to one another, so to speak, that occasionally the bad people can do stuff and get away with it, and it gives them some advantage, but it doesn't take away enough that it causes them not to breed. But generally speaking, people are altruistic, A, because we don't want it happening to us, and we know that by helping others avoid it, others will help us avoid it. And that's just something that evolved as social species do. This is why most species do not kill their own kind. Own species, own larger genus or phylum. This is why we don't kill the other apes for food, because we understand that altruism is useful. And if we let them live, they will let us live, and we will have a mutual kind of thing going on there. Same with agriculture. It came about because of these things. 12. Why is evolutionary just so storytelling tolerated? I don't understand what they mean. Evolutionists often use flexible storytelling to explain observations contrary to evolutionary theory. I don't believe I have done that at all, actually. And I think I've adequately explained the concepts here. You can always check what I'm saying against the actual people in the field, if you so desire. NAS member, I don't know what that is, Dr. Philip Skell wrote, Darwinian explanations for such things are often too supple. Natural selection makes humans self-centered and aggressive. Sometimes, but it also means those people don't tend to breed as much. Serial killers who are stuck in prison don't tend to have a lot of kids. People who are violent that get removed from the society, excommunicated or whatever, don't tend to have a lot of kids. Natural selection makes humans self-centered and aggressive, except when it makes them altruistic and peaceable. Right. That's not supple, that's just pointing out how evolution works. If the society tends to be more violent, then your altruism is going to be more violent. If the society tends to be much more reserved, then your violence is going to make you a social outcast. And vice versa. Because humans are not bacteria, if you haven't noticed, we are much more subtle than that because we are much more complex than any of the parts that comprise us. We don't have to have a special code, and a lot of people don't follow it. But those who tend to stay within a social code tend to have an easier time of life, and tend to be able to make more children who will likely mimic their behaviors. We can show this in other animals. Like in Russia, I think, there was an experiment 50, 80 years ago where a guy took foxes and bred them, and bred them, and bred them. And if there were aggressive ones, he didn't let them breed. And then naturally, they got removed from the gene pool until the offspring were reliably docile. So it is a thing that happens naturally. In the wolf pack, the wolves that don't work together don't tend to find mates. For example, it's just a good way to demonstrate it. When you're talking bunnies, though, bunnies are strictly vegetarian, and they don't tend to be violent towards one another either. They don't seem to understand that God is real, but they're also not generally going out and killing each other because they don't have to. They don't have to compete for the same resources that the wolf does. Where are the scientific breakthroughs due to evolution? All over. The polio vaccine. The vaccines we come up with every year for the flu strains that are most likely to affect us. We have bread and cheese, which are based entirely on the fact that evolution works. Even if they didn't understand it at the time, controlled spoilage is one way of manipulating natural selection to work for a species. So that your food lasts longer, you live longer, and have more children. Generally speaking. Unless, you know, you're one of the unlucky ones that gets the unlucky cheese. And then the people that survive don't eat the cheese that killed you. Or if they think you can survive, they're going to help you try to survive it, so they can learn from the effects of it, or so that they can find a way to make it safe. This is a form of altruism, and it's also self-centered and self-serving. But it exists simultaneously. 14. Science involves experimenting to figure out how things work. Sometimes. Sometimes it involves observing things and then basing hypotheses and predictions upon it, and then experimenting to see if that's correct. How they operate. Why is evolution a theory about history? It's not a theory about history. I just showed you things that you can do. You can take fruit flies and segregate them based on traits. And you'll see that they evolve those traits generally in the next versions, in the next offspring. You can do the same thing with penicillin. That's why we have stronger penicillins now that help you fight off, you know, the flu and colds and whatever. Bacteria, virus, whatever. You get the idea. We can do that because we can control that evolution a bit. 15. Why is a fundamentally religious idea a dogmatic belief system that fails to explain the evidence taught in science classes? It isn't. It's not fundamentally religious. Evolution isn't. Evolution just describes how things, organisms, more specifically, change over time. Over generations. Not one generation. A single generation is not evolution. It's just a thing. Multiple I can't talk, that's fine. Multiple generations are required for evolution. The fact that you have a child and it looks a bit different from you, that's not evolution. But if you have a child who has a child and so on, and they start to look different from you in some way or another, the hair color changes, the eye color changes, you have bacteria that breed, the E. coli, for example, becomes resistant to certain methods that we used to use to deal with it. That's because it changes. It's beneficial to it. The ones that don't have that tolerance die off. Bacteria are weird because some of them have the genes for the resistance and not for the resistance. And when they know they need it, they turn it on in the next separation. And it's really interesting. And it's not adding or subtracting it, it's already there in some cases. So anyway, who is responsible for this pamphlet? I want to know who's responsible for the text. This pamphlet and others like it have been produced by Creation Ministries International. Clearly. And made available to concerned individuals, I am concerned, and churches. Well, I mean, churches are comprised of individuals, so presumably, who wish to help spread awareness of this greatly censored information. It's not censored at all. You can look up any of these arguments. Go to Google, type them in, and you'll get different hits for them. Check them out. Look them up on your own. I'm not telling you to only listen to me. I'm just trying to explain it to you the best way I understand it. Who wish to help spread awareness of this greatly censored information. I read that. The distributors may have put their name in the white space below. This one is distributed by me. You got to watch it on my website, Reverend JR. More copies of this and similar creation pamphlets are available through that place. Go check it if you want. I don't care. I can't stop you. You're an adult, probably. You can do whatever you want. But let's see. We've been about an hour and a little better right now. So that's a pretty good place to leave off for this particular thing. Oh, here's the cover. Question evolution. Well, we just did that. 15 questions for evolutionists. Again, it's not a religion. It's just evolution. We're just talking about it. You don't have to accept it unquestioningly. We're just explaining to you how it works. If you find a flaw in it, and you test it, that's another thing this pamphlet doesn't actually do. It tells us what science is, but then it doesn't actually do any. Science is, you know, testing, developing hypotheses, putting them into experiment. If you want to demonstrate creation, then show us how to test it and observe it, I guess, would be my answer to that. Because this doesn't do that. This just tries to tell us that evolution is false. It in no way tries to tell us what replaces it. So I leave that as an exercise. Denise says, it's been great hearing your views. Thanks. Well, I'm glad you enjoyed tuning in. We don't have to agree on everything, but I like to give you my viewpoint on it. You're much more hospitable than the folks who seem to believe in the flat earth, anyway. Speaking of which, I'd love to do a video on that as well. I asked on Twitter the other day, you know, if you believe the earth is flat and you believe there's a dome, how high up do you believe it is? I got one guy to respond, and he just said he believes there is a dome. He couldn't give me any specifics about it. So, unfortunately, I still don't have anyone to respond to on that. I don't see a dome when I look outside. The rockets seem to go higher than the dome would be. But yeah. We don't need to get into flat earth here. We've had plenty of fun with the evolution. So, if you enjoyed that, don't forget to hit that thumbs up. Leave a comment later if you feel like it, but we've been having good fun here in the comments. Share it with your friends. I want to hear other opinions. I can be wrong. This does happen. I've been there once or twice. But I think I've pretty well got a grasp on this. And, as always, this has been Reverend JR, wishing that the algorithm will favor me, and signing off. You folks have a good evening. Maybe.